The knock at the door for 8 long years. Tobias Redmont had spoken to no one but his horses, the wind, and the ghosts of a life that once felt like home. His ranch sat alone on the high plains of Arizona Territory, where the land rolled out like an ocean of dust and thorn bush, and the horizon swallowed every sound before it reached the next soul. Most travelers didn't even know the place existed anymore. The wooden sign that once marked Redmont Ranch had fallen decades ago, half buried in the earth, weathered by rain and neglect. The roof leaked when storms came through, and the porch sagged like an old man's shoulders. But Tobias didn't mind. Isolation was the only thing that still made sense to him. He'd built his life around silence. Each sunrise began with the same rhythm: the low groan of the barn door, the rustle of feed, the scrape of a shovel against packed earth. Every evening ended with the whisper of firewood crackling in the hearth and the steady creak of his rocking chair by the window. Some men prayed before bed. Tobias just stared into the flames, replaying the same memory until his eyes blurred and his heart grew heavy enough to crush the thought before it could rise again. His wife, Sarah, had loved this land. She'd called it God's quiet country, a place where hard work and faith could build a legacy. His daughter, Mary, had grown up chasing the chickens and collecting wildflowers from the creek. The memory of their laughter haunted the corners of the cabin, faint echoes that refused to fade. But 8 years ago, one visit from a patrol of soldiers had turned that laughter into silence. Tobias never spoke of that day, not to the sheriff who'd come asking, not to the neighbors who tried to help, and not even to the preacher who said time could heal all wounds. Time hadn't healed his. It had only deepened them. That night, the storm came in sudden and violent, the kind that made even the coyotes seek shelter. The sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire. Tobias sat by the fireplace mending a leather bridle, his hands working from habit more than need. The rain drummed against the window shutters, thick and relentless, drowning out every sound except the occasional crack of lightning that turned the cabin walls white for a heartbeat before sinking back into shadow. It was a night meant for solitude, the kind Tobias usually preferred, until the knocking began. At first it was faint, a soft, uncertain tap that might have been the wind pushing something loose. Tobias paused, his needle frozen mid-stitch, head tilted toward the door. He waited. The sound came again, louder this time, deliberate. Someone was out there. His first thought was absurd. No one comes here. Not in years. Not since he'd made it clear that Tobias Redmont wanted no company, no business, no charity, no talk of the past. But the knock came again, faster now, harder. Desperation in every beat. He set the bridle down, the leather falling limp against the table. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted above the mantel. Old habits never died, especially the kind that kept you alive. He moved quietly to the door, boots silent against the wood floor, every nerve sharpened by the rhythm of the rain. Outside, a voice shouted, muffled by the storm, but unmistakably human. It wasn't English at first, though something in the cadence tugged at his memory. Harsh consonants, fluid vowels, Apache. Tobias froze. The blood in his veins turned to ice. The last time he'd heard that language was the same night his wife and daughter had died. His grip tightened on the rifle. He could almost see their faces again, lit by lantern light and fear, the door breaking open, uniformed men shouting that Apaches had raided a nearby camp, that they needed shelter, that the danger was close. He'd believed them, until the truth came out too late. That night, the smoke from his burning barn had carried across the desert for miles. The soldiers never came back. Only the graves remained. The knock came again, more frantic this time, followed by a woman's voice. Her words were broken, but clear enough to understand. Please, we mean no harm. We need shelter. Only for tonight. Tobias's heart pounded in his chest. He pressed his ear to the door. There were more voices, several, all women. Their tone wasn't hostile, not demanding or threatening. It sounded like pleading. Through the wind, he caught fragments. Child. Cold soldiers. Please, he hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger. He'd seen too much of it. He'd buried too much because of it. The storm outside roared, the wind whistling through the cracks in the shutters like 1,000 whispered warnings. He remembered Sarah's voice. Gentle, teasing, full of that kind of faith he'd lost long ago. Tobias, she used to say, don't shut the world out so tight that you forget how to be human. He swallowed hard. Being human had cost him everything once. The voice outside came again, louder now, urgent enough to cut through the thunder. They are coming. If you do not help us, we will die here. That last sentence lodged in his chest. They will die here. He stood there for what felt like a lifetime, his hand resting on the heavy iron bar that secured the door. It had not been lifted in 8 years. Not for neighbor, not for stranger. That iron had become the symbol of his solitude, his wall between past and present. But now it felt heavier than ever, as though the weight of all his fears and guilt pressed against it. Finally, with a grunt that was half resignation and half defiance, Tobias lifted the bar from its brackets. The sound was deafening in the silence between thunderclaps. The hinges groaned as he pulled the door open. Lightning flashed, illuminating a sight that seared itself into his memory. 10 women stood huddled together on the porch, their clothes soaked through, their hair plastered to their faces, their skin streaked with mud and blood. The youngest clutched something close to her chest, a small bundle that whimpered faintly. A child. You have lost much, Ayana said quietly. I see it in your eyes. Don't read me, Tobias replied, though his voice lacked the edge it once carried. Ayana said nothing more. She simply turned to help the others settle, her movements efficient despite exhaustion. Tobias watched as they worked in quiet coordination, tending to wounds, securing the shutters, even setting up a small defensive circle near the door. It struck him that these weren't helpless victims. There was discipline in the way they moved, something deliberate. He'd seen it before in soldiers. The storm outside began to fade, the rain easing into a soft patter. But with the quiet came a new sound, faint, distant, rhythmic. Horses. Tobias went to the window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to see through the slit in the shutter. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hills beyond the fence line. For a brief second he saw movement, dark shapes cutting through the rain. They're here, he murmured. Ayana joined him, her face calm, unreadable. They will come first to the barn, then the house. Tobias turned to her. You talk like you've done this before. She met his gaze. We have been running for 3 days, but before that we fought for 3 years. My husband was a warrior. He died fighting men like Morrison. I do not plan to die begging. Tobias studied her, the way she carried herself, the way the other women looked to her without needing words. He realized she wasn't just their protector. She was their leader. He moved to the gun cabinet and opened it. Inside were 3 rifles, a shotgun, and enough ammunition to hold off a small war. Relics from a man who'd once known how to fight. He grabbed one, checked the chamber, and handed another to her. You know how to use this? He asked. Ayana gave a small, humorless smile. Better than most men I have met. That answer told him everything he needed to know. Outside, the horses drew closer. Tobias could hear men's voices now. Faint shouts over the wind, the metallic jingle of bridles and spurs. His stomach tightened. Get the others ready, he said. If they come, stay low and don't speak until I say. Ayana nodded and disappeared into the shadows, her steps silent. Tobias positioned himself near the door, rifle ready, heart pounding. The fire cast flickering light across the room, glinting off the edges of metal and the determined eyes of those who refused to surrender. The voices outside grew clearer. Laughter. Confidence. Men who thought victory was already theirs. Tobias could make out one distinct voice, rough, commanding, filled with arrogance. I know you're in there, it called. Come out now and we'll make this easy. Ayana reappeared beside him. Morrison, she said, her voice like ice. Tobias's grip tightened on his rifle. He took a slow breath. The air in the cabin felt electric, the kind of stillness that comes before violence, before destiny changes its course. He glanced at Ayana. You still think running is an option? She shook her head. No, tonight we stop running. Thunder rumbled across the sky again, deep and distant. The flicker of lightning revealed the silhouettes of armed riders spreading out around the house. 10 men, maybe more. Tobias's heart steadied. For the first time in 8 years, he felt something he hadn't known he'd missed. Purpose. He looked to the woman beside him, standing unflinching, knife in hand, eyes steady on the door. Then we fight, he said. Outside, Morrison's voice boomed one last time. Open up, old man. Don't make me come in there. Tobias lifted his rifle, took aim at the door and whispered, You already made that mistake once. The wind howled. The fire roared, and somewhere in the darkness, the past came knocking again, this time to meet its reckoning. The storm was dying, but the night had never felt darker. Rain thinned into a whisper against the roof, leaving behind that uneasy quiet that falls between tempests, the kind that makes the air feel watchful. The fire in Tobias Redmont's hearth burned low now, glowing like the heart of a sleeping animal, throwing just enough light to paint the room in trembling gold and shadow. Outside, hooves squelched in the mud. Voices drifted closer, low, confident, cruel. Tobias could hear the jangle of bridles, the scrape of boots against wet boards, the metallic clink of rifles being checked. The men out there moved with the swagger of hunters certain their prey had no claws. Inside, the rancher stood with his back to the door, rifle ready, listening to every heartbeat that wasn't his own. Around him, the Apache women waited in stillness, their silhouettes half swallowed by the dark. You could have mistaken them for statues carved out of patience and defiance. Only their eyes moved, flicking from Tobias to Ayanna to the door, measuring each sound. Ayanna's voice broke the silence, low and calm. They will circle first. They will count our shadows through the shutters. Then they will come for the door. Her certainty chilled him. You've done this before. Yes, she said. Too many times. And always the same kind of men. The old rancher exhaled through his teeth. Then you know they don't scare easy. They should. Her tone carried no bravado, just truth. Tobias almost smiled. A grim, involuntary twitch at the corner of his mouth. It had been years since he'd stood beside someone who didn't flinch at the thought of a fight. He stole a look through the crack between the shutters. Lightning flashed again, bright and white, and for an instant he saw them clearly. 8 riders, maybe 10, spreading out like wolves around his home. The man at their head wore a slick oilskin coat and a hat pulled low against the rain. When the light hit his face, Tobias felt his stomach knot. Even through the distance, Morrison looked every inch the kind of man who believed in his own authority, more than in God. The captain dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud with a wet sound. He turned to his men, shouting orders that were half lost in the wind. 2 peeled off toward the barn, 2 toward the well. Morrison himself strode for the porch, the swagger of a man who thought the world owed him obedience. Tobias stepped back from the window. He's here. Ayanna's expression didn't change. She moved toward the fireplace and pulled a small mirror from a leather pouch at her belt, angling it to catch the flame. The light flickered across it and danced on the walls. Tobias realized with a jolt of admiration. The next second exploded a scream outside, on sharp, guttural cut-off mid-breath. Another cry, then the crack of a rifle muffled by rain. Tobias pivoted toward the window in time to see one soldier drop, a dark shape crumpling into the mud. The others shouted, chaos bursting like gunpowder. Ayanna moved like wind. She and 3 of her women slipped through the side door, silent and sure-footed, vanishing into the storm. Tobias held his position, firing once through the front window. The shot blew splinters from the doorframe and dropped the man trying to kick it in. For a moment, thunder drowned everything. Then came the chaos of men shouting, the clash of metal, the brutal intimacy of close combat in the dark. When the noise finally ebbed, only the rain remained. Tobias opened the door slowly. Bodies sprawled across the yard, soldiers he hadn't had time to hate but couldn't bring himself to mourn. Ayanna stood near the porch, her knife dark in the lightning glow. She wiped the blade on her torn dress without looking down. It's done, she said. He stared at her. At all of them, moving among the fallen with grim efficiency. They weren't trembling. They weren't helpless. They were soldiers of another kind. He stepped out under the dripping eaves. You fooled me, she met his gaze evenly. We let you see what the world expects to see. That is how we survive. Tobias looked past her at the dead men, at the rain washing mud and blood together into the earth. You said 10 were chasing you. Her expression hardened. Morrison was not fool enough to travel alone. Then this isn't over. No, she agreed. It never was. He motioned her inside and together they returned to the fire. The younger women followed, carrying what supplies they could salvage from the soldiers. Ammunition, a canteen, a dry blanket for the baby. When the door shut again, the sound of the storm returned to a steady hush, almost peaceful, though the smell of gunpowder lingered. For the first time since the night began, Tobias saw Ayanna without the veil of urgency. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, her hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. Yet her eyes burned steady, unbroken. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had sat forgotten by the hearth and offered her one. She accepted, sipping carefully, as though the heat reminded her she was still alive. Tobias lowered himself into the chair across from her. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." Ayanna looked into the fire, the orange light tracing the lines of her face. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of many funerals. "Morrison came to our valley last spring. He said he was searching for stolen cattle. We had none. Our people have no use for your herds. But he stayed. He watched us. Then one morning he took our men, and all of them, saying they would answer questions at the fort. None returned." She paused, eyes distant. "That night he came back drunk with his soldiers. They said the men had tried to escape, that they were dead. Then they took our food, our horses, and when some of us fought back, he set fire to the lodges." Tobias felt his throat close. "And your husband?" "He was one of the first taken. I buried what was left of him before we fled." The baby whimpered. Ayanna's voice softened. "The child is my niece. Her mother did not survive." Silence stretched. Outside, thunder muttered like a tired god. Tobias stared into his cup, seeing faces in the steam. Sarah's, Mary's, and the soldiers who had once lied their way through his door. He understood now that the enemy outside his gate tonight was the same rot that had destroyed his life. Arrogance dressed in uniform. Cruelty justified by power. "They'll come again," he said quietly. "Yes. How many? 15, maybe 20? Morrison sent a messenger before he died. They will follow his trail here." Tobias set his cup down, the decision already forming in him like the tightening of a trigger. "Then we finish this before dawn." Ayanna studied him for a long moment. "You would fight for us." He met her eyes. "You didn't bring death to my door, Ayanna. It was already here. I've been waiting 8 years to give it something back." For the first time she smiled, small, fierce, and sad. "Then we stand together." The rest of the night they worked in silence. Tobias showed them the ridge that overlooked the valley, the narrow choke point by the dam, the old mining crates of dynamite he'd kept locked away. Ayanna's women cleaned weapons, set traps, and whispered prayers in their language, voices rising and falling like a hymn of the earth itself. By the time the gray edge of dawn bled across the sky, the ranch no longer looked like a refuge. It looked like a line drawn in the sand. Tobias stood at the fence, the wet wind cutting through his coat, and watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, the rest of Morrison's company was riding toward them. He could almost hear the faint rhythm of hooves growing louder with each heartbeat. Ayanna joined him, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. "You could still leave," she said quietly. "Ride south. No one would know." He shook his head. "If I leave now, I'll spend the rest of my life hearing them scream again. I'm done running from ghosts." She nodded once, accepting the truth in his tone. For a moment they stood together in silence, 2 survivors of different worlds bound by the same wound. When the first rays of light touched the wet fields, Ayanna lifted her chin. "They will come soon." Tobias tightened his grip on the rifle. "Then we make sure they remember where they fell." Far down the valley, the glint of metal flashed. Sunlight on rifle barrels moving fast. The hunt was returning, but this time the prey was waiting. The morning came like a blade of light splitting the storm. The rain had finally stopped, but the land still breathed steam. The earth soaked and heavy, the air thick with the scent of wet sage and gun oil. In that pale half-light, Tobias Redmond stood at the edge of his property and looked across the valley that had once been his peace. Now it was a battlefield. He'd spent the night turning his ranch into a fortress. The fences had been cut down and repurposed into barricades. The barn doors reinforced with iron hinges scavenged from the smithy. The explosion tore the morning open. Fire leapt from the gully, rolling through the wet grass like a living thing. The blast threw 2 horses off their feet, sent others screaming into the air. Men shouted, cursed, fell. The valley echoed with chaos. The pure, unfiltered panic of men who'd believed they were predators, and suddenly found themselves prey. Ayanna's women rose from their hiding places and opened fire. Their rifles cracked like lightning, clean and deliberate. Tobias saw one soldier spin and drop before he could even aim. Another stumbled toward the barn and was met by Nita's arrow through the throat. Keen, still on horseback, shouted for his men to form up, but there was no formation left to make. Smoke and dust swallowed the valley. Horses bolted. The fence posts Tobias had lined with oilcloths ignited next, flaring bright orange, cutting off the soldiers' retreat. Ayanna moved through the chaos with the calm of someone born to it. She didn't waste bullets. Every shot counted. Every step was measured. Tobias followed her lead, firing from cover, reloading, firing again. He'd forgotten how loud war was, how it erased thought and replaced it with instinct. When the gunfire slowed, he heard something else, the low, desperate moan of the wounded. It was the same sound that had haunted his dreams for years. The sound of helpless men realizing justice had caught up to them. Through the smoke, Keen appeared again, stumbling on foot, face blackened with soot and rage. He saw Tobias and lifted his revolver. "You think you can hide behind savages, Redmont?" He spat. "You're no better than them." Tobias didn't answer. He raised his rifle and fired. The bullet hit Keen square in the shoulder, spinning him around. The young lieutenant crashed to the ground, his weapon skidding away. Ayanna was beside Tobias in an instant, rifle trained on the fallen officer. Her voice was steady. "He will send more if we let him live." Tobias hesitated. He looked at Keen, barely more than a boy, face twisted in pain and disbelief. The kind of man who had never been told no by life until now. "Let him crawl back," Tobias said finally. "Let him tell them what he saw. Let him tell them who ended Morrison." Ayanna watched him for a long moment, then lowered her rifle. "Mercy," she said softly. "A harder lesson than death." They stepped back as Keen, trembling, dragged himself toward his horse. The animal shied away from him, sensing weakness. He cursed, grabbed at the stirrup, and finally mounted, swaying as he turned toward the ridge. As he rode off, Tobias felt the adrenaline drain out of him, leaving only the heavy quiet of aftermath. Smoke hung low over the valley. The fences smoldered. The bodies of the soldiers lay scattered among the blackened grass. The Apache women moved among the fallen, collecting ammunition, tending to their own wounded. One of them began to sing, a low, haunting melody that rose like a prayer. Ayanna stood beside Tobias, eyes on the horizon where Keen had vanished. "He will bring others," she said. "I know, we cannot stay here." He looked at his ranch or what was left of it. The fields were torn up, the barn half collapsed, the porch riddled with bullet holes. He thought of Sarah and Mary again, of how they would have wanted him to do more than just die angry. "You'll need to move by nightfall," he said quietly. "There's an old trail through the canyon west of here. No patrols. It'll take you toward the high country." Ayanna looked at him, searching his face. "And you?" He shrugged. "Someone's got to keep them chasing shadows." She studied him, the weary lines, the hands still shaking from battle, and for the first time, her eyes softened, not with pity, but with respect. "You fight like a man who has already made peace with dying." Tobias gave a tired smile. "Maybe I have." She touched his arm lightly. "Then die with purpose. But if you live, find us again. There is more to life than ghosts." Her words stayed with him long after she walked away. As dusk fell, the women packed what little they had left and rode west, silent silhouettes fading into the dark. Tobias watched them go, standing among the wreckage of his home. Smoke drifted lazily across the fields, glowing orange in the last light of sunset. When they were gone, he sat on the porch steps and cleaned his rifle, one slow motion at a time. The wind was cold now, carrying the faint echo of distant thunder. He knew Keen would return, not with 20 men this time, but with an army. He also knew something else. If this was where his life ended, it would not be in vain. Because for the first time since that terrible night 8 years ago, Tobias Redmont had stood his ground, and the world, cruel, unjust, divided, had learned that even the hunted can bite back. The night returned like a thief, silent and cold. The valley, still scarred from the morning's battle, lay under a heavy shroud of mist. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from what was left of the barn, curling upward into a sky bruised with storm clouds. The wind had shifted again, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, the metallic tang of blood drying on the earth. Tobias Redmont sat at his kitchen table, the lantern flickering weakly against the gloom. His hands were raw and blackened from smoke, his shirt torn and stiff with sweat. In front of him lay a map of his own land, sketched long ago, the pencil marks faded and torn at the edges. His eyes followed the line that snaked down from the hills, the creek, the dam, the spillway that fed into the lower valley. He had built that dam himself, 20 years earlier, when he still had a family and dreams of legacy. Back then, it had been a symbol of control, a way to tame nature, to make something useful from a land that resisted every hand but his. Now, staring at it under the wavering light, he saw something else, a weapon, a reckoning. Outside, thunder grumbled across the plains. The storm that had begun days ago was returning, heavier than before, as if the heavens themselves were marching toward the same conclusion he had reached. Nature, he thought, had a way of finishing what men started. He heard footsteps behind him, soft, deliberate. Ayanna stepped through the doorway, her silhouette framed by lightning. Her dark hair was tied back, her face streaked with soot. Behind her, a few of her people lingered near the doorway, their eyes heavy with exhaustion but bright with something stronger, defiance. "You stayed," Tobias said quietly, not looking up from the map. By the time the soldiers arrived, the storm had turned the world into a blur of water and lightning. Keen rode at the front again, his arm bound in a blood-stained sling, face pale but eyes burning with fury. Behind him, 50 men spread out through the valley, torches flickering like devil's eyes through the rain. "There," one shouted. "By the ridge." Movement. Keen's gaze followed the light, a flicker of shadows running toward the dam. "They're trying to escape upriver." He barked, "Cut them off!" But it was too late. Ayanna's people had already reached the ridge, their figures vanishing into the darkness. Only Tobias remained below, standing near the dam's base with the fuse in his hand. His oilskin coat whipped in the wind, his boots half sunk in the mud. The thunder cracked overhead, and for a brief moment the soldiers saw him clearly. One lone figure facing 50. Keen's horse reared, spooked by the storm. "Redmont," he bellowed. "You'll hang for this. You hear me? You're done." Tobias's voice carried over the wind, low but clear. "Maybe, but so are you." He struck the match. The fuse hissed to life, bright against the black rain. Sparks raced along the wire, disappearing into the shadows. Tobias turned away from the flame and began to run, boots pounding the slick earth. Behind him, Keen shouted orders, his voice drowned by the storm. The explosion hit like thunder made solid. The dam ruptured with a deafening roar. A wall of water burst forth, swallowing the valley in seconds. Horses screamed, men shouted, torches vanished. The flood tore through everything, fences, wagons, bodies, carrying the violence of the earth itself. From the ridge, Ayanna and her people watched in silence, their faces illuminated by lightning. The valley below had become a sea of fury, a tide of justice and destruction. Somewhere within it, Tobias Redmont had disappeared. The man who had once lived alone, now consumed by the land he had chosen to defend. Ayanna's hand trembled as she held her pendant to her chest. The storm screamed around her, but inside she felt something strange. Not grief, not triumph, but a deep, solemn peace. Because she knew what Tobias had done wasn't just vengeance. It was balance. The earth had taken back what men had defiled, and maybe, in that wild, merciless act, there was mercy after all. When the floodwaters finally began to recede, dawn broke over a valley reshaped by fate. The ranch was gone. The soldiers were gone. The land was quiet again, scarred but clean. Ayanna turned to her people. "We ride north," she said softly. "And if the spirits are kind, he rides with us in the wind. No gunfire. No thunder. No screams. Only the whisper of the wind passing through the broken remnants of what had once been a ranch, a home, and a graveyard all in one." 3 days had passed since the flood. The storm had drained itself dry, leaving behind a landscape carved into new shapes. Trenches where there had been fences, deep pools where the barn once stood. The air smelled of mud and smoke and something faintly metallic, like the residue of violence that refused to fade. From the northern ridge, Ayanna stood wrapped in a blanket made of woven wool, her face turned toward the morning sun. The warmth felt strange after so many nights of cold rain and grief. Below her, the floodwaters were receding, revealing the bones of the valley, shattered wood, twisted iron, the ghosts of a life swept away. Behind her, the other Apache women sat in quiet circles, tending to wounds and salvaging what little could be saved. They had survived. That was the first miracle. The second was harder to name. The strange, aching gratitude that came from knowing a man they had once feared had given everything, so that they might still draw breath. Ayanna closed her eyes and listened to the wind. She imagined she could still hear his voice carried through it, Tobias Redmont's rough, tired drawl softened by time and distance. You can't tame land like this. You can only earn its respect. She didn't cry. Not yet. The Apaches didn't mourn the way others did. They remembered. And remembering was its own form of reverence. Far to the south in the town of Everspring, word of the flood had spread like wildfire. By the time the first riders reached the nearest outpost, the story had already taken on the shape of a legend. They said a rancher had gone mad, had blown his own dam sky high in a storm, wiping out an entire army patrol. They said the Apaches had cursed the valley, that ghosts danced in the water at night. Some swore they saw torches moving through the mist days later, the spirits of drowned soldiers calling for vengeance. But one man in particular refused to believe the tales. Major Grant Everett rode into Everspring on the 5th day after the flood. His uniform pressed, his mustache trimmed, and his eyes cold with the kind of certainty only men in power could afford. He had come not for truth but for order, and for the Army's reputation. The death of Captain Morrison and his men had embarrassed his command. He meant to fix that no matter what story he had to write to do it. Gather the witnesses, he ordered the sheriff as he dismounted in front of the saloon. I want every ranch hand, every trapper, every drunk who's heard so much as a whisper. Someone knows what happened in that valley. The sheriff, an older man with the cautious eyes of someone who'd lived too long around dangerous men, shifted uneasily. Major, the only ones who came back from that storm are Apache women. No white witnesses left to tell their side. Everett's jaw tightened. Then we'll find another. 2 days later, the Army patrol reached what was left of the Redmont Ranch. The ground was still slick with mud, the water line carved deep into the hillsides. The dam had collapsed completely, its massive stones scattered across the valley like a broken monument. The soldiers moved carefully, their boots squelching in the muck. The silence unnerved them. Looks like hell came through here, one muttered. Everett ignored the comment, his gaze locked on the twisted iron gate that still bore a faded carving. Redmont Ranch, 1878. He dismounted slowly, brushing the mud from his gloves, and walked toward what had once been the main house. Only the chimney stood now, half buried in debris. Sir, a corporal called out from the creek bed. Found something. Everett strode over. In the mud lay a piece of scorched leather. Weeks later, deep in the northern territories, travelers spoke of a group of Apache women who rode together across the plains, led by a woman with eyes like burning coal and a leather holster tied to her horse. They said she never spoke of the man it had belonged to, but at night, when the fires burned low and the wind whispered through the canyons, she'd look south and smile, as if answering a voice only she could hear. The snows melted quick that year, the rivers fat and full, the air smelling of sage and thawed earth. In the high meadows north of the old territories, a small village was rising from the ground, tents, smoke, laughter, the thin bell cry of children playing near the water. It was an Apache settlement reborn from the ashes of the South. The people called it Nadili, place of returning. And at its heart moved Ayanna, not as a fugitive now, but as a matriarch. Her hair was streaked with silver from the storms, but her eyes burned with calm strength. She had become the kind of leader legends grow around, not because she sought it, but because she endured it. Every dawn she walked to the ridge above the valley. The grass there grew taller now, greener than she remembered. From that height she could see the horizon bend into forever, a land free of soldiers, free of chains, but always, when the sun broke the rim of the world, she looked south, toward the ghost valley where it had all begun, and she whispered his name. Months turned to years. Stories of the flood of Everspring spread far beyond the frontier. The Army filed its clean report. The newspapers printed their short columns and moved on. But the folktales refused to die. They said that sometimes, when storms gathered over the Redmont Valley, riders saw a lone horse moving through the rain, a tall figure in a duster coat, hat low, guiding a bay mare along the high ridges. No tracks ever followed him. No one ever caught up. Some called him a spirit. Others swore he was a man who'd simply refused to die. It was near sunset when Ayana first saw him again. She had been tending to a small corral behind the village, mending a gate that had split in the winter winds. The sky had turned to copper and fire, the kind of light that makes everything shimmer at the edges. A hush fell over the camp, that instinctive quiet that animals and children share when something otherworldly approaches. Ayana straightened slowly, her hand still on the gate. Down the long path leading from the ridge came a rider. The horse was a dark chestnut, its mane tangled with burrs. The man in the saddle rode with a limp, one arm bound close to his chest, the other holding the reins with the steady calm of someone who had known pain and made peace with it. He drew closer, and her breath caught. The face beneath the hat was older, worn by sun and wind, but unmistakable. Tobias Redmond, alive. He dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground like it might vanish beneath him. For a moment neither spoke. The camp seemed to hold its breath. Then Ayana stepped forward and pressed her hand to his shoulder, half afraid that if she blinked he'd dissolve like smoke. "How?" she whispered. Tobias smiled faintly, a ghost of the man she'd last seen standing by the dam. "River carried me north," he said. "Guess it wasn't ready to keep me. Woke up 3 days later tangled in driftwood near the canyon mouth. Spent the rest of the time wondering if what I did mattered." Her eyes softened. It mattered. He looked around the camp. The children, the fires, the people rebuilding a life where the world had tried to erase them. "Looks like you answered that for me," he murmured. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind roll through the grass. Then Tobias turned his gaze toward the horizon. "Army thinks I'm dead," he said. "Best they keep thinking that way. World don't need another ghost coming back to stir the dust." Ayana nodded. "Then you stay. Here, no ghosts here, Tobias. Only those who learned how to live again." He looked at her, the lines around his eyes deepening with something between gratitude and disbelief. "You'd let an old rancher among you?" She smiled. "You're not a rancher anymore. You're what the land made of you." Years later, travelers spoke of a small settlement high in the northern hills where whites and Apaches lived side by side. Farmers, riders, children with mixed eyes and laughter that carried far across the plains. They spoke of a man who fixed the fences, taught the boys to ride, the girls to read, and who sat by the fire each night telling stories of rivers that could wash sin clean. He never used his full name. The children just called him Grandfather Toby. When the storms came, and they always did, he'd stand outside his small cabin, watching the lightning over the southern valley. Ayana would join him sometimes, their silence as deep as prayer. One night, as the rain began to fall, she asked him quietly, "Do you ever regret what you did?" Tobias shook his head. "No, only that I couldn't do it sooner. Took me too long to learn that sometimes mercy comes wearing the face of destruction." Ayana's eyes glistened in the firelight. "And peace." He looked at her, a soft smile breaking through the storm. "Peace comes when you stop looking for it, when you start protecting it." The last storm came years later. A wild spring tempest that rolled down from the mountains with a roar like the voice of the earth itself. The villagers huddled in their tents as lightning split the sky. When the morning came, the air smelled of cedar and clean water. They found Tobias's cabin door open, the chair by the fire empty. His hat hung neatly on the hook, his rifle leaning against the wall. Outside, near the ridge, hoofprints led down toward the river. One horse, one rider, both fading into the distance where the grass met the clouds. Ayana stood there a long while, the wind pulling at her hair. She didn't cry. She only smiled, faint and knowing, because she understood some journeys never end. They just change their name.